Hello, Virgo. I'm going to be blunt right from the start. Someone being obsessed with your pictures isn't the compliment you might think it is. Someone fixating on your image without actually knowing you is surface level attraction at best, unhealthy attachment at worst. So before we explore whether there's genuine interest building or just shallow infatuation, let's get clear about what actually matters in connection. And, spoiler, it's not how good you look in photos. Images create illusion. They capture single moments stripped of context. They present curated versions of reality that may or may not resemble the full truth of who someone is. They allow projection, people seeing what they want to see rather than what's actually there. And in the age of social media, where everyone's life is reduced to scrollable content, where intimacy gets performed through carefully selected images, it's easy for someone to build entire fantasy about you based on pictures, based on aesthetic, based on the version of you that's been filtered, framed, and presented for consumption. But that fantasy, no matter how intense it feels to them, it's not about you. Not really. It's about who they imagine you are, who they need you to be, who they've constructed in their mind using your image as raw material. And if someone's obsessing over your pictures, if they're dying to reach out, if they're building entire narrative about connection based on visual content, they're not interested in you. They're interested in idea of you. And those two things are vastly different. Do you recognize the difference between someone being attracted to your image versus interested in your actual person? Think about whether you've experienced this distinction before, because here's what might actually be happening. There could be someone who's been consuming your social media content, scrolling through your posts, looking at your pictures repeatedly, building familiarity that feels like knowing, even though it's entirely one-sided. And that consumption, it's creating something in them. Desire, maybe. Curiosity, possibly. The sense that they want to know more, to establish connection, to move from observer to participant in your life. But here's what you need to understand. The intensity of their interest doesn't reflect your actual compatibility. It doesn't indicate that they're right for you. It doesn't mean connection would be meaningful if it actually happened. It just means they've formed attachment to representation of you. And attachment to representation is fundamentally different from connection with actual person. Have you ever been disappointed when someone who seemed interested based on images turned out to be completely different in reality? Recall that experience if it's there. Because let me be specific about what obsessing actually looks like. They check your profile frequently. They notice when you post. They engage with your content, even if that engagement is passive viewing stories, scrolling through photos, absorbing what you share without necessarily commenting or making themselves visible. They're building narrative in their mind about who you are based on what you post, what you share, how you present yourself. They're constructing personality, values, lifestyle from curated glimpses. They're imagining scenarios, what it would be like to talk to you, what connection would feel like, what relationship might look like. All of this happening entirely in their imagination without any actual interaction to ground it in reality. And that imagining, it's creating pressure. The longer they observe without acting, the more built up the interest becomes, the more invested they get in mental version of you. the more urgent the desire to finally make contact. But here's the problem. The mental version they've created, it's not you, it's projection. And when they finally do reach out, when fantasy meets reality, when they encounter actual you instead of imagined you, there's often massive disconnect. Because real you, complex, multidimensional, full of contradictions and complications, doesn't match the simplified, idealized version they constructed. Does knowing someone might be fantasizing about you based on limited information feel flattering or concerning? Check in with your actual response, because I need to address what you might be feeling about this. Part of you might be pleased, might like idea of someone being so interested they're consumed by it, might enjoy thought of being desired intensely even if that desire is based on incomplete picture. And that's understandable. Being wanted feels good. Being the object of someone's fascination creates sense of value, desirability, power, but be careful, because that kind of attention, obsessive, image-based, built on fantasy, it's not sustainable foundation for real connection. It's not healthy basis for a relationship. It's not form of interest that serves your long-term well-being. So yes, notice if someone's showing signs of intense interest, but don't let that intensity become the thing you chase. Don't start posting specifically to get their attention. Don't shape your online presence around maintaining their obsession, because that path leads to performing for someone else's fantasy rather than living your actual life. Are you already adjusting your online presence to maintain someone's attention? Be honest about whether you've started performing, because here's what dying to call you suggests. They want direct contact. They want to move beyond passive observation into active engagement. They want conversation, connection, the experience of actually interacting instead of just consuming content. And that desire, it might be reaching point where internal resistance is breaking down, where fear of rejection is being overcome by intensity of wanting, where not reaching out is becoming more uncomfortable than the risk of reaching out. So they might make move, might send message, might find excuse to establish contact, might finally translate observation into action. But, and this is crucial when they do, when they finally reach out, when they make themselves visible in their interest, you need to assess reality versus fantasy. You need to notice whether they're interested in actual you or whether they're still relating to imagined version. Do they ask questions that show curiosity about your real life? Or do they make assumptions based on what they've observed? Do they want to know your thoughts, experiences, perspectives? Or do they just want to confirm the fantasy they've constructed? That distinction tells you everything. It tells you whether this is person capable of seeing you or whether they're just looking for someone to inhabit their projection. Will you be able to make that assessment when the moment comes? Practice looking for those signs now, because I want to talk about what you actually want. Do you want to be obsessed over? Do you want someone dying to call you because they've been fixating on your pictures? Do you want intensity built on surface attraction and fantasy? Or do you want to be genuinely known? Do you want someone interested in your actual complexity? Do you want connection built on reality rather than imagination? Because you can have attention. That's easy. Post attractive photos, maintain visible social media presence, be aesthetically appealing. Attention will come, but attention isn't the same as connection. Obsession, isn't the same as genuine interest. Being fantasized about isn't the same as being truly seen. So, what are you actually hoping for? What would actually satisfy you? Get clear on that before you get swept up in flattery of being wanted. Because here's what often happens when fantasy based interest finally manifests: the person reaches out, you engage. Initial conversation feels exciting because there's been all this buildup, all this anticipation, all this energy that's been accumulating. But then reality starts seeping in. They say things that don't match who you actually are. They make assumptions that reveal they don't really know you. They relate to the version of you they constructed rather than the person you're presenting in real time interaction. And you have choice. You can correct them, can show them who you actually are, and see if they can adjust their perception to match reality. Or you can perform the version they expect, can become the fantasy they created, can contort yourself to fit their projection because disappointing them feels worse than betraying yourself. Most people choose the second option. And that's how you end up in relationships where you're constantly performing, constantly trying to be the person they think you are instead of who you actually are. Which option would you choose? Be honest about your pattern. Because let me also address the validation piece. If you're getting energy from knowing someone's obsessing over your pictures, if you're deriving sense of worth from being desired based on images, that's external validation. That's your value being determined by someone else's perception. That's fragile foundation for self-worth. Because what happens when they stop looking, when their interest fades, when they move on to obsessing over someone else's pictures? Does your value decrease? Does your worth diminish? Do you suddenly become less because you're no longer the object of their fixation? If your answer is yes, if loss of their attention would impact your sense of self, that's problem. That's dependence on external validation that makes you vulnerable to manipulation, to performing, to losing yourself in service of maintaining someone else's interest. Real worth is internal. It exists whether or not anyone's looking. It remains stable regardless of who's paying attention. Are you building that kind of worth? Or are you addicted to external validation? This question matters more than whether someone calls, because here's what you actually need to know. There might be someone who's been consuming your content, who's built interest based on what they've observed, who's working up courage to reach out. And if they do, if they make contact, if they express their interest, you get to decide how to respond. Not based on flattery, not based on relief that someone wants you, not based on excitement of being pursued, but based on whether they're actually seeing you, whether they're interested in reality or fantasy, whether they can handle the real you or whether they only want the curated version. And that assessment, it protects you. It keeps you from wasting time on connections built on illusion. It prevents you from contorting yourself to match someone else's projection. So when the call comes, if it comes, don't just answer because you're flattered. Answer because you're curious. And stay curious enough to assess whether this person can see past the pictures to the actual human holding the phone. That's the only version of this that serves you. The only version that could actually become something real. Everything else is just performance art, and you deserve more than that. Real connection requires seeing beyond the surface. Demand to be known, not just admired.